The line at Prairie Plains Co-op stretched past the seed counter and into the boots and gloves aisle, men in clean logo caps checking commodity prices on new phones while coffee steamed in paper cups stamped with the bank's name. Heather Murray stood near the back with a handwritten list folded in her palm, her coat elbows patched with canvas cut from an old feed sack. Dried mud flaked off her work boots onto the polished concrete. Outside, her 1993 Chevy idled in the lot, with one door 2 shades lighter than the rest of the truck and a wire holding up the muffler. The odometer had turned over 312,000 miles in January, and she'd marked it with a pencil note on the dashboard. Keep oil at 4,000 miles, not 5,000. In front of her stood Wade Kincaid, whose family farmed 6 sections and whose belt buckle looked expensive enough to rent. He wore a quilted vest with his lender's embroidered logo, and when he laughed, the key fob in his hand flashed the emblem of a new diesel duly parked at the curb with paper dealer tags still taped in the window. Heather heard him tell someone, "Payments only $8,700 a month if beans hold," like he was discussing weather. When her turn came, the young account clerk scanned her customer number, frowned, and glanced at the supervisor's glass office. "Ms. Murray, unsecured accounts are discontinued this season. You'll need to complete the Prairie Plains financing packet." Heather set 2 fingers on the stack of forms without picking them up. She read the first page anyway. 9.1% APR, variable adjustments, blanket lien on crops and machinery, mandatory insurance rider, late fee schedule in 8-point print. "I pay cash," she said. The clerk gave a small, tired smile people used with stubborn relatives. "I understand, but this is policy now. We can't release seed without bank approval." Wade turned half around, enjoying it. "Ain't no shame in financing, Heather. Everybody does it." Everybody, she thought, is why everybody panics at the same time. She thanked the clerk, tucked her list back into her coat, and walked out under the buzzing fluorescent lights. By the time she reached the truck, 2 conversations had already started behind her in the lot. "Can't qualify, sounds like." "Probably overextended and hiding it." She closed the truck door gently. The rust around the window frame left orange dust on her sleeve. She wiped it off and drove home on County Road 4, past fields still gray from winter and barns that looked richer than hers. People in Reno County had decided what Heather was years ago. Frugal to a fault, maybe proud, maybe behind the times, maybe one dry year away from an auction flyer. They measured solvency by paint and horsepower. Her barn roof was patched in 5 places with mismatched tin. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the sink she kept meaning to replace for 15 years. Her overalls faded at the knees every spring and every fall. She still planted a ceremonial first row of beans by hand along the field edge with the same rusty hoe her grandmother left her, handle-worn smooth where 2 generations had gripped it. What nobody saw clearly, because she never offered and nobody asked in the right way, was that every acre she worked was paid for. Every bill was paid in cash, and every decision she made had been built on 30 years of arithmetic, done at a scarred oak table after supper. Her education in money started with fear. In 1988, when she was 12, she sat on a metal folding chair in the back of a crowded room, while her father stood at an auction block with his cap crushed in both hands. She remembered the rhythm of numbers shouted too fast to think about, the auctioneer's voice rising and dropping, her mother staring at the floor as the 4-4-3-0 tractor sold, then the hay rake, then a line of equipment that had looked permanent to Heather until that hour. Her father had borrowed short against long and refinanced twice when rates climbed. One dry season and one medical bill had finished the job. Afterward, her mother took a bookkeeping job in town and spoke of interest like it was a person who sat down at the table uninvited and kept eating. Her grandmother Vera, who lived 3 miles over and owned 40 paid-off acres of bean ground, gave Heather no speeches about wealth. She gave her chores and small rules. Count first, want second. Pay yourself before somebody else invents a fee. If it rusts and loses value, don't borrow for it. Vera kept envelopes in a flour tin. Taxes, repairs, seed, church, winter propane. She'd slide bills into each one on the first of every month, then close the lid with a hard little tap as if sealing a contract. Heather watched, then copied her own version when she got older. Coffee can labels, later a ledger notebook, finally a spreadsheet printed each quarter and filed by hand. When Vera died in 1996, Heather inherited that rusty hoe, a chipped pressure cooker, and no dramatic windfall. Just an example, and the legal title to those 40 acres held in trust until she turned 25. The land became her anchor. She rented it out first, then farmed it herself once she could cover inputs. She worked mornings at a feed mill and nights doing inventory for a hardware store, banking wages and living on less than half. By 2002, she had saved enough to make her first purchase, an adjacent 60-acre tract from a retiring couple who wanted a clean, quick sale. Price? $72,000, paid by cashier's check. No note, no balloon payment waiting like weather. From there, her method looked boring enough to be invisible. Boring was the point. She set a personal living budget and treated it like gravity. For years, it was $24,000. Once insurance and fuel climbed, she adjusted to roughly $28,000 and refused lifestyle creep. No cable package, no restaurant habit, except one pie and coffee morning each month. She kept phones until updates stopped. She wore work coats until cuffs shone. Windfalls did not become purchases. They became options. Every surplus dollar had a job before she spent it. In the early 2000s, when CDs paid real yields, she laddered maturities at an average around 5.9%, renewing only what she didn't need for operations. Later, she shifted chunks into treasuries near 4.3% as rates changed. She read statements like weather maps. She did not speculate. She did not chase. Land came in pieces as neighbors aged out, heirs split estates, or somebody needed immediate liquidity. In 2007, she bought another 120 acres in Cloud County for $264,000 cash after 2 brothers disagreed for 9 months about listing with a broker. In 2011, she closed on 80 rough acres with drainage problems for $176,000. Then spent 3 off-seasons improving water flow with rented equipment and patient grading. In 2016, she took a final 180-acre parcel at $610,000 from a family relocating out of state, again cash, again quiet, total purchases from 2002 to 2016, eventually adding to 480 acres for a combined $1,122,000. She never bragged because bragging invites comparison, and comparison is how people start buying what they can't carry. The county interpreted her silence as struggle. She let them. 2 days after the co-op rejected her cash preference, Heather drove before dawn to a farm auction near Sylvia, where wind snapped at the lot flags and men stamped their boots in frozen dirt. Most bidders came for a late-model combine and a pair of high-clearance sprayers. Heather came for the unglamorous line at the edge, an older 6-row planter with worn gauge wheels, a tool chest, and 3 pallets of replacement chains. A broker in a pressed coat glanced at her bidder card and said, "That unit's rough. Probably not worth hauling home." I didn't ask if it was pretty, Heather said. The planter sold for $4,800 because everyone else was busy bidding six figures on painted steel and touchscreen displays. She paid on the spot from an operating account with no draw request and no lender call. The auction clerk counted bills, surprised enough to look up twice. Back home, she and her two hired hands, Luis Ramirez and Mattie Jo Keller, both practical and underpaid by county standards but steady, spent 3 evenings rebuilding the row units. They replaced chains, packed bearings, and welded a cracked bracket Mattie found before it failed in field. Total parts and labor, $1,960. Comparable custom planning quote she'd gotten in February. $31 an acre, payable up front. People say you're cheap, Louis said around a wrench. Heather tightened a bolt. Cheap buys junk twice. I buy useful once and maintain it. By mid-March, fertilizer quotes began climbing hard. $610 per ton to $940 in less than 6 weeks. Diesel touched $5.37. Everybody cursed the numbers at the coffee shop, then signed whatever financing paper kept product moving. Most larger operators already carried equipment notes north of $1.8 million at 7.75% variable, and treated each month like a bridge to the next refinance. Heather wrote checks, not recklessly, methodically. She prepaid enough inputs for core acreage, left marginal ground flexible, and held a cash reserve she would not breach except for weather emergencies. Her ledger tracked cost per acre in pencil at first pass and ink after settlement. She could tell you what each field needed and what it could return at conservative prices, not hopeful ones. At the chamber lunch in town, a local banker gave a speech about modern scale strategy. He wore a suit the color of wet asphalt and clicked through slides showing debt as an accelerator of growth. During questions, somebody asked about operators who avoided financing. Debt-free farming is romantic nonsense, he said, smiling like he'd been waiting for the line. You can't compete in real markets with nostalgia. Heads turned toward Heather at the back table because she was easy to identify. Faded overalls, thermos coffee, no tie to any bank logo in the room. She kept eating her chicken-fried steak and did not raise her hand. A week later, county roads washed out under a late April flood. Culverts failed. Low crossings disappeared under brown water for 2 days. Planning windows narrowed from comfortable to urgent. Commodity alerts started pinging phones all over Reno County. Bean contracts jumped to $34.20 per hundredweight for growers who could plant immediately after fields dried. That kind of price move turns men frantic. Custom planters demanded payment up front and scheduled by account priority. Growers with pending loan approvals waited on signatures while days burned off the calendar. Rumors outran facts. This family was short on operating cash. That one's line got cut. Another had collateral tied up. Heather's name circulated too. She refused financing. Must be broke. Can't plant fast enough with those antiques. Finally caught up to her. She heard it all and kept moving. The rebuilt planter was slower than new iron, but ready. Her seed was stacked, tagged, and paid for by cashier's receipt in a metal file box. Fuel tanks were topped before the roads closed. Louise and Mattie ran shifts. Heather took the midnight checks herself. Walking field edges with a flashlight and that old hoe propped by the truck bed like a joke nobody understood. By the first clear week after the flood, engines rolled across the county in every direction, some financed to the decimal, some waiting on a banker's callback, all racing the same sky. From the highway, Heather Murray's place still looked like she was barely holding on. The barn tin was patched. The house paint peeled near the porch steps. Her truck coughed at stop signs. Inside her office drawer, under seed tags and grease-stained invoices, the columns lined up exactly as she intended. Acres paid, costs covered, reserves intact, no signatures owed to anyone who could call a note. For now, that was enough. For now, nobody believed it. For now, nobody believed it. By the second week of planning, Heather had slept in 3-hour blocks and learned exactly how long her rebuilt planner could run before a bearing started to talk. She learned which low spots stayed tacky after the flood and which ridges crusted over too fast in the afternoon wind. At 1:41 morning, she parked at the north edge of the home quarter, shut off the truck lights, and listened to the engine tick down while Luis and Mattie finished the last pass. Across the section line, LED bars from newer rigs moved like ships, bright, expensive, perfectly straight. Her own rows weren't as pretty from the road, but they were in, seed depth checked. Stands acceptable. No signatures owed. At dawn, she spread 3 binders across the oak table in her kitchen, beside a yellow calculator with 2 cracked keys and a mug of reheated coffee. She did that whenever noise got loud outside, rumors, prices, advice she hadn't asked for. Numbers were quieter. Binder 1 was labeled Living. Binder 2, Operating. Binder 3, Long Money. Inside Living, each year fit 1 page. 1997, total spending, $18,900 new, $44. 1998, $19,306. 1999, $20,112. 2000, the year she bought the Chevy for cash, from a lineman in Nickerson, $21,487, including tags, insurance, and a starter motor 6 months later. By 2004, she hit $23,900 and held there. By 2012, insurance and utilities forced her to $26,400. By 2019, she settled around $28,000 and treated that number like a fence line. Visible, fixed, not to be drifted across just because a year went well. Inside Operating, the pages were messier, pencil marks rubbed out and rewritten as weather changed outcomes. 1997 to 2001 were mostly wages from the feed mill and hardware inventory, plus rental checks from Vera's 40 acres. Small, dependable. She saved $14,200, then $16,900, then $15,300, then $17,100, then $18,400. Save first, written in the margins every January. In 2002, she made the $72,000 land purchase, and that year's notes had 3 underlines beneath one sentence: never confuse available cash with excess cash. She ended the year with only $11,600 liquid after taxes and inputs. Slept badly for 2 months. Did not repeat that close call without building a bigger buffer first. 2003 through 2006 looked boring to anyone who wanted drama. That was the point. She farmed the ground she had, worked part-time in winters, and banked annual operating surpluses of $24,100, $28,500, $22,700, and $31,400. She didn't scale. She tightened, used parts when reliable, skipped upgrades that added comfort, but not return. By December 2006, liquid reserves and maturing CDs sat just over $269,000. 2007 bought 120 acres in Cloud County for $264,000 cash. 2008 rebuilt reserves to $58,000. 2009 drought year. Still ended positive, $17,800 surplus because fixed costs were low and there was no bank payment waiting. 2010, $43,500 surplus. 2011, bought 80 acres rough ground for $176,000 cash. Set aside $19,200 over 3 seasons for drainage improvements done mostly with rented equipment and her own labor. 2012 through 2015. Steady accumulation, annual surpluses between $36,000 and $74,000 depending on weather and price, most of it not touched. Then, 2016, the big parcel, 180 acres for $610,000, paid by wire. Her note from closing day sat clipped to the deed copy. Breathe. Then keep living the same. She had done the same math so many times she could recite it while greasing fittings. If a machine was depreciating and not directly increasing net return, she paid cash late or bought older. If a purchase required debt service that only worked at optimistic prices, she treated it as unavailable. If she couldn't explain an investment to Maddie in 5 plain sentences, she didn't buy it. Inside long money, every maturity was laddered. Early years, 12, 24, and 36-month CDs averaging about 5.9% before rates changed. Later years. Treasury notes around 4.3%, staggered so something came due every quarter. Interest wasn't thrilling. It was dependable. Dependable was how you stayed in the game long enough for years to do the heavy lifting. She ran a fingertip down one page and added quietly, "Discipline beats drama by distance." That afternoon at Jansen's Cafe, the county's other math sat in open conversation. Nobody there was stupid. Nobody there was lazy. Most were better mechanics than Heather, and some could farm circles around her on field efficiency. But they had chosen the model everyone said was modern. Bigger footprint, faster iron, debt as a tool. It worked beautifully until 3 variables moved at once. Wade Kincaid took the stool near the pie case and dropped a folder thick enough to stand on. "Rate reset letter," he said, not smiling this time. "Operating line from 6.4 to 9.8. Equipment notes float in July." He wasn't whining. He sounded tired. Across from him, Troy Becker did his own arithmetic out loud. "We locked a sprayer at 4.9. But the combine's variable. Cash rent went to $295 an acre on the new lease. Diesel where it is, fertilizer where it is. We need a clean year just to stay neutral." At the corner booth, Ellen Hobson stirred coffee she never drank. "Bank wants 15% curtailment by October. Says it's policy we've never missed." Heather listened, because this was the part people rarely said in public. Debt pressure didn't just cost money, it cost timing. When input windows were short, borrowers waited on approvals and covenant calls. When markets moved, they sold when notes required, not when bids were favorable. When equipment failed, replacement choices were made under deadline, where dealers and lenders had the leverage. Darrell slid into the booth beside Heather, uninvited, smelling like cologne and diesel. "Still no financing?" he asked, loud enough for 3 tables. "Still no," she said. He gave a sympathetic chuckle that carried judgment under it. "You know, if this season bites, my offer on your south quarter still stands. 4-1 an acre, clean close, no fuss." She looked at him for a long second. "Market's over 6. I'm taking risk. You're taking advantage." He raised both hands like he was joking and pivoted to Wade. Conversation rolled on. What struck Heather wasn't that others borrowed. Plenty of responsible operators did and survived. What struck her was how narrow the margin had become for everyone at once. New tractors came with software subscriptions and 7-year notes. Land rents rose on neighbor rivalry, not yield reality. Inputs were financed because cash was tied in machinery that still depreciated whether rainfall came or not. A system built for momentum had almost no brakes. 3 weeks later, the brakes were tested. The flood that delayed planning was followed by a hard, dry heat dome that sat over central Kansas like a lid. 37 days with almost no meaningful rain. Daytime highs over 100. Night winds pulling what moisture remained. Emergence that looked promising on Memorial Day started to stagger by late June, especially on lighter ground. Then the policy hits came like thrown gravel. USDA acreage revisions signaled higher bean plantings nationally than traders expected. Futures dropped. An export licensing slowdown at Gulf terminals backed basis out another notch. Local contracts that had spiked to $34.20 per hundredweight after the flood slid to $28.90, then $26.40 in a week and change. Not ruinous by themselves, but ruinous when paired with high variable interest and input bills financed at spring peaks. Prairie Plains Co-op sent a bland email about temporary settlement timing adjustments. 2 checks that normally cleared in 7 days took 21. For leverage farms, that gap mattered more than any speech at chamber lunch. By early July, casualties had names. Ellen and Mark Hobson, who farmed 1,120 acres with 2 sons, received a formal demand: reduce outstanding debt by $312,000 before renewal or surrender, leased ground as collateral substitution. They sold 320 rented acres they'd improved for 12 years, plus a grain trailer and the older tractor Mark swore he'd be buried with. Their debt still stood above $2 million. Troy and Melanie Becker took a bridge loan at 11.2% to cover fertilizer and payroll when settlement checks lagged. Bridge turned into burden when the rate reset clause kicked after 60 days. Their monthly debt service jumped from $41,000 to $57,000 in 1 quarter. Troy stopped sleeping and started coming to the shop before dawn just to sit in the pickup with the engine off. Wade Kincaid made June payments by selling old crop inventory into a weak basis, then got hit with a margin call on hedges he'd put on to protect spring prices. Protective strategy, correct in theory, catastrophic when cash was already tight. He listed one of his newer semis and told nobody until the listing photo showed up online. Even suppliers shook. A custom applicator in Arlington parked 2 rigs because clients couldn't prepay. A seed rep quietly asked for partial cash from everyone, even long accounts, because his own credit terms had tightened upstream. Heather's season wasn't easy. Her stands on the West 80 were uneven where crusting followed flood silt. She spent unplanned money on a pump repair and 2 emergency irrigation sets. Revenue projections dropped with the same market everyone faced, but there was no monthly lender draft leaving her account. No covenant letter, no call option exercised by someone in an office 60 miles away. She could decide to hold grain, to cut costs, to wait a week for basis recovery, because waiting did not trigger default. One hot evening, near the end of July, she stood in the machine shed with Luis and Maddie, all 3 of them streaked with dust. She laid out the numbers on a clipboard. Yields off 15% on average if August doesn't turn. At current bid, we're still above break-even on owned ground. Marginal fields are thin, so we cut discretionary passes now. No panic spending, no panic selling. We protect cash and finish clean. Maddie nodded. That's it? That's it. Luis leaned against a tire and let out a breath like he'd been bracing for worse. Feels weird hearing bad news and not hearing a bank in the same sentence. Keep it weird, Heather said. 2 days later, white pickup trucks with utility logos appeared along County Road 4, idling near fence lines with survey stakes in the bed. At first, she assumed they were marking culvert repairs from the flood. Then, a landman left a card in her mailbox requesting a meeting about a pipeline easement and routine title confirmation across affected parcels. Routine, the card said. Heather slid it into her ledger binder, closed the cover, and looked out at the bean field rippling under hot wind, green on top and hiding more than anyone guessed. She slid it into her ledger binder, closed the cover, and looked out at the bean field rippling under hot wind, green on top and hiding more than anyone guessed. The next morning, Heather called the number on the card. A man named Colin Mercer answered on the second ring, voice polished from years of making inconvenient things sound ordinary. Prairie Corridor Midstream. Ms. Murray, thank you for calling. We're finalizing easement maps and title runs. I'd like to review your affected acreage and compensation options. Come by at 6, Heather said, before fieldwork. He arrived in pressed jeans and clean boots that had never met real mud. He spread maps on her porch table, weighted corners with his phone and keys, and traced a line with one finger. Proposed corridor crosses your home quarter by about 900 feet. Temporary construction easement plus permanent right-of-way. Standard rate in this block is $3,200 per rod. Heather studied the map, then the legal descriptions. This parcel list is short. He blinked. How so? You're showing 80 acres in Reno County under my name. You're missing 400 in 2 counties, including the track tied to your alternate route. Colin gave a polite laugh, then saw she wasn't joking. Our title team pulled current records. Pull again, she said. By noon, she was at the Reno County Register of Deeds with a canvas folder that looked too thin to matter. Inside were certified copies of deeds going back 20 years, mineral reservations, probate filings from Vera's trust, and one yellowed memorandum she'd never needed to show anyone because no one had asked. The deputy clerk, Anita Sloan, adjusted her glasses and started flipping pages. At first, her expression was routine boredom. Then it shifted. Confusion, then concentration, then the kind of surprise people tried not to wear in public offices. Hold on, Anita said softly. She called over the title abstractor, then the senior clerk. 3 women stood shoulder to shoulder over Heather's paperwork. Anita tapped a line item. You retained 100% mineral rights on the Cloud County parcels. Yes. And this assignment, she turned another page, shows production payments from 2 shallow gas wells pooled beneath sections 14 and 15. Net revenue interest confirmed. Going back 14 years. Heather nodded once. Colin's phone buzzed 3 times in his hand. He ignored it and stared at the deed chain like it might rearrange itself. Ms. Murray, with respect, these holdings weren't reflected in our preliminary ownership file. Preliminary isn't final, Heather said. By 2 o'clock, Prairie Corridor's title counsel had joined by speakerphone. So had a lender representative from the bank that held liens on several adjacent farms and needed subordination agreements before any easement checks could clear. Heather sat at the end of the counter, hands folded, while professionals hurried to catch up to the woman they'd filed under small operator. The corrected ownership schedule was read aloud in a voice that had lost its polish. Reno County, 220 acres, fee simple, debt-free. Cloud County, 260 acres, fee simple, debt-free. Total owned, 480 acres, no mortgages, no blanket liens, no UCC security interest on land. Mineral rights retained, qualifying interest beneath 300 plus acres, 2 active shallow wells historically producing. Recorded net mineral revenue, 14 years. $1,260,000 after severance tax and operating deductions. Current investment account statements provided voluntarily. Laddered treasuries and bonds. Market value $1,740,000 as of last quarter close. Silence sat heavy for a beat. Anita, who had known Heather since high school and had once slipped her extra napkins at basketball concession stands, stared at her like she'd discovered a second language. Colin cleared his throat. For our documentation, do you have a personal financial statement? Heather slid over a single page, not decorative, no logo, just line items in black ink. At the bottom, net worth, $5,214,380. He read it twice. Anita whispered, not quietly enough. Lord have mercy. The number moved through town before supper, not because Heather announced it, but because every title correction touched another desk, and desks had ears. By evening, Jansen's Cafe had switched from rumor to recalculation. Wade leaned over the counter, reading a screenshot someone texted from someone who had no business sharing documents. 5.2 million? From beans? From not spending, Ellen said, half awed, half wounded. Darrell laughed too hard. Paper assets. Everybody's rich on paper. Paper don't make cashiers checks, Troy muttered. At 7:30, Darrell drove out anyway, dust plume behind his half-ton, and found Heather replacing a hydraulic hose by the machine shed. He stayed by the truck door like he didn't want grease on his jeans. You could have told family, he said. You didn't ask in good faith. He kicked at gravel. I made an offer. You made a discount. His jaw flexed. People think you made us look foolish. Heather tightened the clamp and stood. I didn't make anybody sign anything. Darrell had no answer for that. He left with his headlights off until he reached the county road. 3 weeks later, on an August Tuesday that began with humidity thick as syrup, Prairie Plains Co-op filed Chapter 11. The notice hit inboxes at 8:12 a.m. By 8:30, phones lit up from Sylvia to Nickerson. By 9, men who usually argued politics were standing shoulder to shoulder in the co-op parking lot, reading the same sentence over and over. Grower settlements temporarily suspended, pending court-supervised restructuring. Temporarily meant nothing when loan drafts were due Friday. Inside the office, staff moved like people carrying glass. The manager had red eyes and no new information. Accounts payable was frozen. Receivables totaled millions. The bean cleaning line, the one piece of infrastructure, every small and mid-sized grower depended on to meet contract specs, was listed as a likely liquidation asset if no buyer emerged quickly. At 11 a.m., the county extension office called an emergency meeting at the fairgrounds. Folding chairs filled the livestock pavilion. Families came in work clothes and church clothes, some straight from fields, some from bank offices where the words forbearance and additional collateral had already been used. Heather sat near the back at first, not hiding, listening. A bankruptcy attorney explained priorities. Secured creditors first, unsecured growers in line, timelines uncertain, maybe 90 days, maybe longer. Voices rose. Someone swore. Someone cried quietly into a sleeve. Then Ellen stood. 90 days and we're done, she said flatly. We don't have 90 days, Wade added. If that line gets auctioned to Wichita, half this county can't move beans before quality discounts eat us alive. The extension agent looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Does anyone here have a workable proposal? Not complaint. Proposal. Heather stood up. It wasn't dramatic. No speech cadence. She held a legal pad and 2 certified bank letters clipped together. I can fund a purchase of the bean cleaning line and related receivables tranche, she said. Up to $850,000 wired within 48 hours, contingent on court approval and transfer, clear of legacy liens. The pavilion went still enough to hear a fan belt squeal overhead. She continued. Not as sole owner, as seed capital for a grower-owned LLC. If you want it saved, you own it together and run it like adults. Someone in the third row said, "This a joke?" Heather lifted the bank letters. No. The extension agent stepped down from the platform and took the papers with both hands. Certified balances. Verification of immediately available funds. Contact numbers for confirmation. His face changed as he read, the way Anita's had at the courthouse. "What are the terms?" Wade asked, voice cautious. Heather read from her pad. First, no personal guarantees required from member families for this acquisition phase. Second, mandatory cash flow training for all member operators and spouses or partners who handle books. 8 sessions, attendance recorded. Third, each member contributes a 10% reserve on projected seasonal operating costs into a restricted account before distributions. Fourth, debt service cap. If your total annual principal and interest obligations exceed 25% of 3-year average gross farm income, you enter a remediation plan before receiving co-op advances. Fifth, transparent reporting. Monthly statements to all members. No hidden side agreements. Murmurs rolled through the chairs, some offended, some relieved. A man near the aisle barked, "So now we gotta take budgeting class from the woman with the rusty truck?" Heather met his eyes. "Or take auction class from the bank." No one laughed. But nobody argued that point. By evening, 23 farms had signed letters of intent. By midnight, 31. Within 4 days, 41 family operations joined the new entity. Prairie Grower Recovery, LLC. The bankruptcy court approved the asset purchase on emergency motion because no other buyer offered both cash and immediate local continuity. Heather wired $850,000 Friday morning at 9:17 a.m. The first disbursement schedule went out 72 hours later. It wasn't charity in the soft sense. It was structured mercy. Hobson Family Farms, Ellen and Mark, received $118,000 in expedited settlement advances tied to delivered beans, enough to satisfy a curtailment demand and prevent forced sale of another 200 leased acres. Outcome: they kept both sons on payroll through harvest and negotiated a 12-month lender workout instead of liquidation. Becker Ag Partners, Troy and Melanie, received $96,500 against verified receivables, plus a $40,000 short-term operating bridge from the LLC reserve pool at 2.5% annualized, replacing their 11.2% bridge note. Outcome: monthly debt outflow dropped by $11,300. They avoided default and retained health insurance for 3 employees. Kincaid Row Crop, Wade's operation, received $173,000 in stage settlements conditioned on hedge reconciliation and revised cash flow reporting. Outcome: sold 1 non-essential semi as planned, but avoided covenant breach that would have triggered cross-default on equipment notes. 3 beginning farmers under age 35, each farming under 300 acres, received smaller advances between $18,000 and $27,000 plus direct bookkeeping support to keep input vendors from cutting them off. Outcome: all 3 finished harvest and renewed leases for the next season. Within 2 weeks, the LLC had processed $2.1 million in member settlements that would otherwise have sat frozen, and no member farm entered foreclosure that month. People started showing up at the mandatory training defensive, arms crossed, ready to be insulted. Heather opened the first session at the extension classroom with a whiteboard and no small talk. "Today is not about shame," she said. "It's about sequence." She wrote 4 lines. 1. No true living costs. 2. Separate operating cash from ego spending. 3. Never finance depreciation unless the math survives bad prices. 4. Build time reserves, not just dollar reserves. Then she handed out templates, not fancy software. Column sheets, monthly inflow, fixed outflow, variable outflow, debt service ratio, contingency trigger. Ellen stayed after class, papers pressed flat under both palms. "I thought we were disciplined," she said quietly. "Turns out we were just busy." Heather nodded. Busy feels like progress. Sometimes it's just noise. At session 3, even the loud aisle guy from the pavilion asked a real question about restructuring machinery notes versus selling one high-payment unit. At session 5, spouses who'd never been included in lender meetings started catching errors in their own amortization schedules. At session 8, Troy Becker stood up and admitted, in front of everyone, that he'd confused revenue with cash for 10 years. "That mistake almost cost us the farm," he said. "I'm done pretending." No one mocked him. They were all too close to the same edge. By September, the numbers themselves became a kind of local curriculum. The extension office asked Heather to document her model in plain language so other operators could stress test their own assumptions. She agreed on one condition: no hero story, only arithmetic. So they built a workbook from her actual history, anonymized where needed, but specific where it counted. Part A. Household constraint. Average personal living spend held near $28,000 per year despite rising income years. Modeled effect over 20 years versus county average lifestyle inflation. Approximately $640,000 retained capital before compounding. Part B. Cash purchase. Disciplined Land acquired 2002 to 2016. 480 acres total for $1,122,000 cash. If financed conventionally at blended 6.5% over staggered terms, projected interest cost would have added roughly $402,000 to $515,000 depending on refinance periods. Avoided interest became deployable reserve. Part C. Mineral income allocation. Net well income over 14 years, $1,260,000. Allocation rule, 70% to long-term ladder, 20% tax/maintenance, 10% optional liquidity. Resulting ladder value, $1,740,000 at current marks, demonstrating reinvestment plus yield effect, not just raw receipts. Part D. Volatility survival test. Scenario modeled, 15% yield decline plus 20% price decline plus 30 days settlement delay. High debt sample farms crossed debt service distress threshold within 45 days. Low debt/high reserve model remained solvent without asset sale, preserving decision flexibility. They added a county impact page from the LLC's first 6 weeks. Farms participating, 41, emergency asset purchase, $850,000, settlements accelerated, $2,100,000, bridge refinance from high-interest products, $486,000, foreclosures prevented in immediate cycle, estimated 41 operations retained, pending long-term compliance, training completion rate, 89% households represented by at least 2 adults. Heather refused to put her face on the cover. The extension agent used a photo of hands over a ledger instead. Still, everyone knew whose hands. One Friday evening, after the sixth training session, Wade waited while others filed out. He looked older than Spring, like somebody had turned the brightness down behind his eyes. "I said things," he started. "At the co-op. Before." "You weren't alone," Heather said. He nodded. "You could have sat on your money and watched us drown." She packed her papers into the same canvas folder she'd carried to the courthouse. "I don't need to watch that twice in one lifetime." He frowned. "Twice?" "First time I was 12, she said. "Auction ring?" Understanding moved across his face slowly, then settled. That's why. That's why." Outside, trucks started and gravel popped under tires. Harvest wasn't done. Debt wasn't magically gone. Some farms would still have to downsize, sell ground, or unwind years of bad structure. Heather never promised otherwise. Arithmetic had mercy in it, but not fantasy. As she locked the classroom door, her phone buzzed with a message from Anita at the courthouse. Pipeline team accepted corrected route terms. Easement check ready Monday. Heather looked out toward the dark fields where beans stood waiting under a thin moon. Beneath them, gas still moved through old rock. Above them, for the first time in months, so did hope. Above them, for the first time in months, so did hope. Monday came with a north wind and a line at the temporary office trailer behind the bean cleaning plant. The old Prairie Plains sign had been unbolted but not replaced yet, so the building looked like a house with a missing tooth. Inside, folding tables held laptops, legal pads, and a coffee urn that never stayed full. Heather stood at the center table in a denim shirt with grease on one cuff, reading the wire confirmations while the new LLC bookkeeper stamped settlement packets. "Next," the bookkeeper called. Ellen Hobson stepped up with Mark beside her, both of them carrying the posture of people braced for bad news. Heather handed them a packet with tabs. "Advance settlement, $118,000, Heather said. "Breakdown is here. Receipts attached. Moisture discounts already accounted for." Mark stared at the number, then at Ellen, then back at Heather. "This clears the curtailment?" "If you send it today and include this letter," Heather said, tapping the top page. "I copied your lender's ag officer. They can't claim uncertainty on receivables now." Ellen swallowed. "We sold the North lease to make June. I thought we were done by Thanksgiving." "You're not done," Heather said. "You're thinner. Different thing." Ellen's laugh came out shaky, then turned into a hand over her mouth. Mark reached for the packet like it might disappear if he moved too fast. Behind them, one of their sons, Caleb, home from Hayes for harvest, stood in the doorway and looked down hard at his boots. By noon, the Hobsons had paid the curtailment demand and avoided the second forced acreage sale. 3 days later, Ellen came back with a pie in a foil pan and a clean spreadsheet. "I split household from operating," she said, sliding the sheet over. "Never did before. We were paying ourselves whatever was left. Turns out, whatever was left is not a plan." Heather looked it over and nodded once. "That sheet will save you more than the advance did." At 2 in the afternoon, Troy and Melanie Becker arrived with their youngest, asleep in a car seat, and their oldest carrying a lunchbox full of crayons. They looked wrecked in the way sleep deprivation makes honest people look guilty. Troy sat down and said it before Heather could open her folder. "I did dumb things." "You did common things," Heather said. "Now we do uncommon corrections." She pushed over their restructuring worksheet. High-interest bridge note replaced. Receivables advance, $96,500. LLC bridge, $40,000 at 2.5%. 90-day review. Weekly cash log required. Melanie did the math on her phone, then did it again with a pencil. "This drops us $11,300 a month," she whispered. "That's payroll, That's groceries. That's oxygen, Heather said. The oldest kid looked up. Are we in trouble? Troy pulled him close. Less than last week. By harvest end, Becker Ag had kept all 3 employees. By January, Melanie had taken over monthly reporting and found $18,200 in annual leakages, subscriptions, idle lease equipment, duplicate insurance riders. Nobody had noticed when money moved faster. In February training, Troy stood at the whiteboard and pointed to his own line items. This was ego, he said, circling one machinery payment with a red marker. This one, too. If it doesn't increase net return, it doesn't get financed. Put that on your fridge. The room laughed, but they wrote it down. Wade Kincaid came in after dark, alone. No vest with a lender logo this time. No shiny fob twirling in his hand. He set a single key on Heather's table. Dealer tag still attached. Sold the dually, he said. Heather looked at the key, then him. Needed to? Needed to act like I needed to. He sank into a folding chair. I kept the semi-sale, dropped 2 lease options, and I'm inside your 25% cap if this basis holds. She checked his revised debt service worksheet. He'd done the work cleanly, no hopeful yield assumptions, no hidden off-book liabilities. You're at 22.8, she said. That gives you weather room. Wade rubbed both hands over his face. Dad says we're shrinking. You're surviving, Heather said. Those aren't synonyms. He nodded toward the plant floor where grain dust floated in the work lights. Never thought I'd sit in this building asking permission from you. You're not asking permission, Heather said. You're agreeing to rules you should have had before. By spring, Wade had converted one hired position from equipment operator to records and logistics, hired a community college grad named Shonda, part-time, and stopped making decisions off dealer brochures. He still farmed hard. He just stopped mistaking volume for margin. The 3 beginning farmers arrived nervous, almost apologetic, like they'd wandered into a room for older people. Jasmine Lee farmed 190 acres of rented ground with her mother and had been one missed settlement from losing her lease. Cole Herrera ran 240 acres and a welding side business out of a shed his uncle had framed in the 80s. The third operation was siblings Micah and Ruth Bell, first generation, farming 280 acres and keeping books on a phone app that categorized seed as shopping. Heather sat them down with Luis and Maddie at a side table. This isn't rescue, she said. It's structure. Each received a smaller advance between $18,000 and $27,000, plus an assigned mentor and mandatory reserve targets. Jasmine got Ellen, Cole got Troy, Micah and Ruth got Melanie, who fixed their chart of accounts before lunch. What happened next was the part no one put in headlines. None of them bought anything flashy. They paid the boring people first. Jasmine brought her landlord current and signed a 2-year lease instead of a 1-year scramble. She hired a local teenager, paid him on time, and told him exactly what taxes would come out, so he wouldn't get surprised in April. Cole paid his fertilizer vendor cash on delivery for the first time in 3 seasons and got an early order discount that beat any special financing offer he'd been pitched. Micah and Ruth paid off a predatory short-term note, then opened separate operating and household accounts. When Ruth said, "Feels like less money," Melanie replied, "It's the same money. Now you can see it." By December, the multiplier effect had a sound. Fewer late-night panic calls to spouses, more ordinary conversation at Jansen's, and the steady clatter of businesses in town actually getting paid. The tire shop owner stopped extending risky 30-day tabs. The feed store rehired a clerk. One of the co-op scale operators who'd been applying for jobs in Wichita took his resume out of his truck glove box. At the LLC's first quarterly review, the bookkeeper read the numbers out loud. Settlements accelerated. 2.1 million. High-interest bridge debt replaced. 486,000. Member delinquency against reserve policy down from 39% at onboarding to 11% now. No foreclosures in participating farms this cycle. No one clapped at first. They just sat with it. Then Mattie started one sharp clap, and the room followed. The antagonist's reckoning came in two places, the chamber lunch and Heather's own driveway. At the December chamber luncheon, the banker who had called debt-free farming romantic nonsense stood at the podium under a banner that read Reno County Growth Outlook. His name was Grady Phelps, and he looked like he hadn't slept much either. He clicked to a slide titled Portfolio Stress and Revised Underwriting. The room was full. Farmers, spouses, suppliers, people who remembered his spring smile. "We are instituting updated policy," Grady said, voice flatter than before. "New operating lines will require documented household budgets, liquidity reserves, and debt service stress tests at conservative commodity prices." Someone from the back called, "Sounds romantic." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, not cruel, but not gentle either. Grady didn't argue. "Call it whatever you like. We finance too much depreciation and too little resilience. That is on us as well." Afterward, he walked over to Heather by the coffee urn. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Publicly, privately. Heather poured coffee. "Be right going forward." He nodded once. "We asked the extension office for your training template." "Use it without my name on it," she said. "Done." Darrell's reckoning was less public and more human. He came out to Heather's place on a gray Sunday in January, with no cologne and no performance in his voice. He stood on her porch with both hands in his coat pockets and stared at the patched barn tin he used to joke about. "I owe you an apology," he said. Heather waited. "I tried to buy your South Quarter cheap," he said. "I told myself I was helping. I wasn't." "No," Heather said. He exhaled steam into the cold. "I'm liquidating 2 toys and a lease truck. Bank gave me terms if I get my ratio down. I want into the LLC. Then you attend class, all 8. He gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "I deserved that." "You deserved arithmetic," she said. "Class is Tuesday." Darrell showed up Tuesday. He sat in the second row, took notes with a free pen from the extension office, and stopped trying to be the loudest man in the room. By year end, the county paper requested records for a profile, and for once, Heather didn't refuse. She met the reporter in her kitchen at the scarred oak table, where the floor still dipped near the sink and the coffee pot still hissed like an old radiator. Anita from the courthouse sat in too, mostly to keep legal terms straight and gossip inaccurate. The reporter, a young man with careful handwriting, read from his notes. "You're comfortable with these figures being public?" "If they're accurate," Heather said. He read them off slowly. Land value, current estimate, $3,408,000. Bond ladder and treasuries, $1,740,000. Cash reserves, $312,000. Equipment value, $180,000. Total debt, 0. Estimated net worth, $5,640,000. He looked up. "Anything to add?" Heather set 3 mugs on the table. "Yes. Net worth is not character, but cash flow habits become character if you repeat them long enough." The story ran on A1 with a photo she disliked because it made her look stern. The headlines still used the old language, rusty hoe, hidden fortune, because editors loved a hook. But the body included the actual method, page after page of plain numbers. That winter, the LLC voted to allocate co-op profits into two permanent programs. First, a revolving 2.5% operating fund for beginning farmers under strict cash flow rules. Not easy money, accountable money. Second, the Vera Murray Scholarship, named for Heather's grandmother, paying AIG student tuition only if recipients completed a debt avoidance practicum and submitted a viable 5-year farm budget reviewed by 2 independent mentors. At the scholarship launch in the high school ag shop, grinders and welders pushed to the walls, Heather stood beside a metal sign welded by Cole Herrera. Count first, want second. The extension agent handed out applications. This is the only scholarship packet I've seen that asks for projected maintenance costs on used equipment. Good, Heather said. Louise leaned over to Maddie and whispered, "Kid's gonna hate that question." Maddie smirked. "Kid's gonna learn from that question." Roll call came at the first annual meeting of Prairie Grower Recovery, LLC, held in the same livestock pavilion where people had nearly come apart in August. This time the chairs were set in circles, not rows. Ellen Hobson stood first. "We kept both boys on farm payroll, no additional forced sale, debt still heavy, but on a plan we can explain in 1 page. Mark added, "I sleep now." Troy Becker followed. "No defaults. Health insurance retained for all employees. Sold 1 underused machine, paid down high interest exposure, and we're teaching monthly cash meetings at church basement for whoever wants them." Melanie held up a binder. "If your spouse isn't in your numbers are fiction." Wade Kincaid reported next. "Debt service ratio under cap 2 quarters running. Bought nothing new this year. That sentence hurt to say and felt good after." The room laughed. Jasmine Lee. "Lease renewed, reserve funded at 10%. First year she ended with cash after taxes." Cole Herrera. "Welding side business now scheduled instead of emergency only. Farm account current. No supplier holds." Micah and Ruth Bell. Separate books, no predatory note, signed their first forward contract without violating liquidity targets. The loud aisle guy from August, his name turned out to be Donnie Sloat, stood and scratched his beard. "I thought this was all control nonsense," he said. "Then I did the sheets, found out I was paying interest on feed I sold 6 months ago. So, I was wrong again." Even Grady Phelps, the banker, attended and sat in back without introducing himself. During open comment, he said, "Our branch adopted debt service caps modeled on this group. Loan volume is down. Delinquency is also down." At the edge of the room, Colin Mercer from Prairie Corridor Midstream shook Heather's hand. "Your corrected title work changed our internal audit process," he admitted. "We no longer assume small, visible operation equals small ownership." "Good policy," Heather said. Anita Sloan got a standing ovation she tried to wave off. "I just read documents," she said into the mic. "Exactly," Heather called from her chair. "Reading documents saves farms." When the meeting ended, people stacked their own chairs. Outside, the same old 1993 Chevy waited under sodium lights, one door still the wrong color. A few members had quietly voted to offer Heather a vehicle stipend from administrative funds. She declined it in writing and asked that amount be shifted to scholarship reserves. "Truck still runs," she said. "Scholarship doesn't run itself." Her house looked exactly the same from the road that winter. Patched roof, peeling paint, kitchen floor still not replaced. The 6-row planter, rebuilt and repainted only where rust had become structural, sat under cover beside 2 coffee cans full of sorted bolts. Louise stayed on full-time and bought a small place outside town with a down payment he'd saved under the new budget template. Maddie took on operations coordinator duties for the LLC and taught machinery maintenance workshops for scholarship students every March. Bearings, chains, seals, and the economics of fixing instead of flexing. Heather never married and never tried to become a public figure. She signed papers, taught classes, checked fields, and paid taxes on time. Some evenings she sat at Vera's old flour tin, now holding scholarship thank you notes instead of envelope cash, and ran a thumb over the dent in the lid where her grandmother used to tap it shut. On the first planting day of spring, before the tractors moved, she walked to the edge of the home quarter with the rusty hoe on her shoulder. Wade arrived in his work pickup and leaned on the fence. Ellen and Mark came with thermoses. Troy brought both kids, now old enough to ask real questions. Darrell came too, stood a little apart, and listened more than he spoke. Heather set the blade in the soil and pulled one straight row by hand, the same ceremonial first row she'd always planted. Dark earth turned, beans dropped, heel pressed. Jasmine watched and asked, "Why still do this when you've got equipment?" Heather rested on the handle and looked down the line she'd made. "To remember pace," she said. "Machines scale speed. Ritual scales judgment." She handed the hoe to Jasmine. "Your turn." One by one, they each took a few feet, awkward then steadier, until a whole ragged first row crossed the edge of the field like a signature made by many hands. No one there confused that row with yield. It was something else, an agreement. Count first, want second, pay yourself before fees, don't borrow for rust, leave room for weather and for other people. When engines finally started and the modern rigs rolled, the old hoe leaned against Heather's truck tire, blade caked with fresh Kansas dirt. From the highway, a stranger could still look over and decide she was barely holding on. Up close, everyone who mattered knew better. The fortune had never been the wells or the bonds or even the land value on a statement. Those were results. The real wealth was the discipline beneath the beans, plain, repeatable, unglamorous, and now it belonged to more than one woman. Heather climbed into the Chevy, turned the key, and the engine caught on the second try. She smiled, checked her mirrors, and drove toward the field,